Well, the answer, Wilfred, is that we don't know where we are because the United States is lagging behind on testing to see how many people actually have got the COVID-19 disease. Now, the indications are that the United States should be as exposed as almost any country to infection from China. That's one of the things that the network scientists at Northeastern University have shown, and I quoted that in my Wall Street Journal piece. We are very integrated, the United States, and particularly the West Coast, into China. And so a lot of people came here from China in January and even into February. The probability is that we don't have hundreds of people with the virus. It's more likely thousands and, in fact, plausibly tens of thousands. So we still don't know that, and we won't know it for possibly weeks because there has been such a shortfall in testing. But everything we know about network science and epidemiology tells us that it's highly likely that some parts of the United States will have a South Korean, if not an Italian-style experience. And so it's very early in the game in the United States. But you have to look at what's happening in those countries and project forward a few weeks and imagine the United States in that situation. Anybody who's not doing that is living in the same box that President Trump is in, as Jim Cramer just mentioned, telling themselves, oh, it's no worse than the flu, it's just going to be the flu. That actually is completely wrong because the mortality rate is likely to be significantly higher for the flu, and we don't have the kind of herd immunity that we have to influenza. We don't have the kind of vaccinations that we have for influenza. This is a new coronavirus. It is not the flu, and therefore its impact, as we've seen in the rest of the world, is likely to be really quite considerable, particularly for elderly people.
Yeah, you mentioned the president's response, Neil. It's something I wanted to ask you because I know in all of your work as a historian and an author, you've looked really closely at leadership, and you've said very positive things about President Trump in the past. So what do you think is the disconnect here between what we're getting from the administration, what we're seeing in the markets, and what the truth actually is?
The test of any president is the crisis. And what's been a striking feature of the Trump administration has been that actually the crisis took until the year of his re-election to happen. If you look back, let's just take the presidency of George W. Bush. You can see two quite different effects. 9/11, which was a huge shock, in some ways comparable to the shock of COVID-19, led President Bush to show his greatest strength, actually. The response that he gave, defiance, leadership, vengefulness, resonated with the American public and helped the U.S. overcome that shock. It also made him very popular. But when President Bush was hit by the financial crisis in 2008, he looked clueless and his popularity imploded. Luckily for him, he wasn't up for re-election because he'd served 2 terms. Or look at his handling of Katrina, which happened in 2005 after he'd secured a 2nd term. If he'd flunked Katrina the year before, if that hurricane had struck New Orleans 2004, he might have been a 1-term president. I worry that President Trump has got on the wrong side of this, that the line he's taking, tweeted out again today, that it's just another influenza, is going to come back to haunt him in this election year. And I'm afraid it's just not in line with the science of what an epidemic like this, indeed a pandemic, which it is in all but name, does, not just in terms of mortality and sickness, but also in terms of the effects that it has on public confidence. And I think when you look at what's happening, not only in Asian economies that have been affected, but also in Europe, you see that the effect of consumer confidence tanking is really very profound economically.
So Neil, what about President Xi Jinping then? I mean, to what extent, I know we don't get very trustworthy opinion polls coming out of China, but to what extent would opinion in his leadership have fallen? And where do you stand on how big the economic impact is going to be on China?
Well, the economic shock was very great indeed, as you could see in the PMIs, really unprecedented declines in economic activity because of the quarantine measures that had to be imposed on Hubei and indeed the restrictions on movement in China as a whole. The line that they're now taking in Beijing is that we're getting back to normal. Hubei is going back to normal. It's early to be doing that, and there is a significant risk that you get a second wave of infections. But I think what's happened is that China's leadership bungled this in the first phase, really denying that there was a crisis until it was very far advanced in Wuhan and Hubei province. But then, because they have a one-party totalitarian regime, they were able to impose the most drastic quarantine that I think there has ever been in human history. What I don't think is going to happen is that Western democratic governments are going to be able to replicate that. Even although they're trying in Italy, it's very hard for a democracy to do what they did in China. So I think the big question, which, as I said, is still in the realm of the unknowns, is how significant a problem is there going to be, not just in Washington state, in California, but potentially in New York, and indeed in other states that already are showing signs of having the beginnings of that exponential growth in confirmed cases that we've seen in so many other countries. If you get something like South Korea or Italy, it's very difficult for the United States to act like Xi Jinping and quarantine a state. And that, I think, means that the response in democracies is likely to be less drastic and therefore less effective than the response we saw in China.